Okay, well, first, thank you for inviting me to do this, to maybe share some memories and some reflections on Solomon Yashere. Yeah, I've actually now, as I arrived as kind of the young, cool prof on campus many years ago, and Solomon was already one of the established professors, but I arrived 35 years ago, and I'm just right now at at the FERP retirement stage. But Solomon was here when I arrived, and he was already considered just a real just a real special part of this campus. Yeah, CSUB is a special place, and I've been here for a lot of it, and Solomon was here for 44 years on the campus. So it's a special place, and I say that Solomon was a big part of making it a special place. He was a special person that was part of this. But anyway, just in terms of his background, and I'm sure there's you're doing other interviews and other things, but so I won't get into too much of the detail. But he arrived back in 1972. The campus opened in 1970, and by 1972, he was already here, the Department of English and Communications. He arrived, and actually, one of the stories was that he held a record for advancing from assistant to associate and tenure. He actually did that in 2 years. He arrived in 72, and within 2 years, he went from assistant to associate, tenured, and within 4 years from there, he was a full professor. It takes the rest of us much longer to do that. But yeah, but that had to do with he already had arrived with standing as an academic, as a scholar, and immediately with his teaching and his impact on the campus, he advanced as a professor very quickly. But I'll just say that I won't go through all of his resume information, but he held all the various roles in his department and the programs and campus committees and actually as a campus administrator at one time. So he had many roles and he's known for all of those. But I'll just say that some of the things that you probably should know about him is that I never took a course from him, obviously, but I just knew about some of his teaching and some of his scholarly work. He was someone who he taught in English and communications, but he taught Shakespeare. I primarily knew him as the Shakespeare professor, and but he also taught African literature and African American literature, and he taught in the African oral tradition. That was one of his special areas of study and scholarship. But he was somebody who lived in the moment, and he was with you, or whether you were a student, whether you were a faculty person, an administrator. He lived in the moment. He was with you at all times, and students appreciated that greatly. As in helping to prepare the nomination for the Faculty Hall of Fame, as I tried to collect some quotes and comments from students and faculty and others, and just said, what would you share with me and what I could find. And I came across quotes from students who just talked about him. One of them said, I'm trying to remember the wording. One of them mentioned that Professor Iyasere was a combination of joyous energy, moving exuberance, and clear perception contained by careful patience and sensitivity. He was patient and sensitive, beyond description. He was that way with students. Students said that he was known for always having an open door and an open mind, and he always gave them critical comment, but very honest and constructive always. So students, many of his students went on to become award-winning writers and playwrights and professors. So he left behind in his students much of what he was about in terms of his scholarship and teaching and his ways of interacting with students and with others. he was famous to me for he spent a lot of time on campus. Uh, he would walk around campus and he'd sit down somewhere. He'd find a comfortable spot on a bench or somewhere, and he would talk to people as they went by. And he did that with me many, many times. I was usually rushing. Right? I was kind of the young guy, trying to, trying to move my career along and rushing along from classes and whatever it might be. And he always had a way of calling you over and saying, sit down. And I'd say, Solomon, I'm in a rush. He said, it's not that important. Sit down. So I'd sit down, and then he'd say, and how's your family? How are you enjoying your students? How are you doing? And when he was with you that way, you were the only thing important to him. He was completely in the moment, and you were the only thing that mattered. So we all knew him that way. Other faculty, as I say, he was a mentor to many of us in many ways, but also in that way, he placed importance on his students and the campus and on faculty. On the campus, he was highly regarded by the administration. He was a very good friend of Dr. Arciniega, President Arciniega, who was our president for 21 years on the campus from the 80s into the 2000s. And I had opportunity to work with Dr. Arciniega for a few years as assistant to the president. But Solomon, he had worked for President Arciniega as an administrator, and then he decided that the classroom and being out with the students was really what he preferred to do. But during the time that I was connected with the president, Solomon, he often would be invited in, or he'd send message to the president saying, well, if you got a little bit of time, I'd like to stop by. And my recollection was that the president would say, tell Solomon I'm available, tell him to come over. And any time of the day, he'd walk in and he'd sit with the president and he'd talk about the campus, about what's going on with faculty and students, and where he saw the campus going. And he just had a way that he had the respect of everyone, as they say, with administrators, students, faculty. But as a scholar, as I should say, he had a reputation much bigger than this campus. He was once selected among 50 faculty across the country, 50 professors, by the American Association for Higher Ed and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. He was selected as an outstanding professor for his scholarship, his teaching, and his leadership. So he was, and his scholarly work was, I came to really find out much of this later on, was translated into various languages across the world. It was regarded that way, that it was translated in many of his works. And he wrote some highly regarded analyses, critiques of the work of Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize-winning recipient in literature. But he did analysis of his work, and actually also of a famous author, Nigerian author, Chinua Achebe, as I came to find out who that was, because one day as I was crossing campus, as I did often see Solomon, not on campus, but in this particular case, he wasn't calling anybody over or sitting down with anyone. He was kind of just sitting by himself. And he looked like he was kind of in deep thought. And that was one time where I actually initiated the question. I said, what's going on with you, Solomon? What's going on? You look like you've got something on your mind. And he says, yes. He says, I've just been invited to write a nomination for a Nobel Prize in Literature for a Nigerian author. And he began to tell me about the author, Chinua Achebe. He began to tell me a little bit about him. He says, because I was given the honor, he said, I'm invited to write a nominating letter. And he said, to him, it was like one of the big accomplishments of his career to just to be asked to write that kind of a letter, which he did. But Joey, I'm saying that he was, his scholarship was recognized far beyond this campus, far beyond the nation. So he really was a world scholar in that sense. But as I say, probably to me the most important were those kind of moments when I crossed him on the campus. And in fact, he had gotten into the habit of sitting on a bench right outside of our building right here, because he in the later years he was in our building. We were all sharing the same building, and it was kind of a convenient spot for him to come down the breezeway right outside the door here. Kind of a nice quiet shady spot, and he would sit on the bench and I'd cross him there. And then one day it was on a Thursday. On a Thursday, and he was out there, and I again was rushing out the door, and he says, as he used to say, young man, come over. And I say, Solomon, I'm in a rush. I've got to get somewhere. He goes, no, you don't. He goes, that's not important. So sit down. So I sat down, and again, he did. He as they say, he was always in the moment, and he said, how are you doing? And he listened. He wanted you to share with him how you were doing. He says, how are your kids? And again, he would say, are you enjoying your students? So we had that kind of a conversation. And I usually would always say, but I got to go with him. I got to leave. I got to go. But I spent some time with him that day. And I said, we'll talk more later, Solomon. I said, I'll be back. I'll be back. So that was actually the last time I saw him. When I returned to campus on Monday, he had already passed away over the weekend. So it was kind of a shock. But anyway, I say that we all lost a real prize at the campus. We lost Solomon.
When Solomon and I arrived in Bakersfield in September 1972, CSUB was a fledgling campus. It was then California State College. It was exploring new ideas, expanding the curriculum, rich with abundant opportunities. Solomon relished each venture, especially designing and teaching courses for his students, building programs tailored to the students' needs. What many may not recognize or know is that a lot of those courses and programs were new to Solomon as well as to the campus. His background was in rhetorical theory and Shakespeare, and he used his extraordinary acumen and research skills to expand into dimensions that the students needed for their lives and their careers. A few examples. We had a robust writing program at the college, at the university. But the focus, of course, was on writing for academia. And Solomon said, our students may not all wind up in the academy. How about turning the focus a little bit to helping them with writing for the real world? He developed a course in technical writing, offering that in the early 80s. And the first term, the class had 4 students. So of course that was not sufficient enrollment and it was about to be canceled. And he said to the chair, please don't cancel it. I have a great deal of confidence in this course that the students need it. I'll teach it for free. Of course, that was fine. He could teach it for free as an overload. That first term, he taught those 4 students. The following term, there were 2 sections, full. And since then, technical writing has been offered in multiple sections every term at the campus. He similarly modified the master's in English to include masters in the teaching of writing. And he was instrumental in expanding communications from an emphasis into a degree program and ultimately helping the entire department emerge on its own. That same creativity was part of Solomon's enthusiasm in pursuing research and scholarship, especially as his writing helped him improve his teaching and the students' apprehension of literary works. Sometimes he traveled to Nigeria to record the oral tradition, the storytellers, who were then a dying breed and may no longer exist. And in one instance, he transcribed into Edo the murder of Adesuwa, and then translated it into English and published it. So historically, that record now exists because of the unique contribution he made. He did similar things when he published an article on, "Pardon me, Professor, why do I have to read Othello?" Because Othello's a tough go for many students, especially students from diverse backgrounds. And Solomon wanted other teachers to know that it could be done and that it should be done. I believe that article was cited by ETS, Educational Testing Service, as certainly recommended and may have been required reading for high school English teachers that year. Tomas is right. Solomon did study the works of Chinua Achebe. He was invited to write an article, a letter of nomination for Achebe to the Nobel Prize Committee. And one of the articles that Solomon did, called Narrative Techniques on Things Fall Apart, has been republished multiple times in several languages, English obviously, French and German as well. And most recently it was published in a Norton anthology, or a Norton edition of Things Fall Apart. And the Norton edition says this is a classic work of literature. It's an imprimatur. It's a high benchmark. And the Norton edition of a work will also include about, 10, a dozen essays. If your essay is in there, that means it is a quintessential piece of scholarship in the Achebe. That's where Solomon's Narrative Techniques is now published. And so he was especially proud that Norton recognized the stature of his contribution there. The kinds of ways in which he adapted his service to the community mimic what he did in teaching and in scholarship. He was, at the invitation of Dr. President Tomas Arciniega, the founding director of Diversity Services. He chaired the Department of English. But what he wanted to do was to give more students more opportunities, and so he was instrumental in several scholarship programs, co-chairing, for example, and co-founding the Ernest B. Williams Scholarship. In the early days, back in 1972, when we first came to the campus, and I'll show you a picture from those early days. Here's Solomon, here, walking across the campus in front of what is now Administration West. It was at the time the offices for the president, who was Paul Romberg. And these are the trailages where the wisteria grew. He always had that briefcase, which we still have. And he was always excited to walk across the campus, as Tomas said, to meet and greet and to interact with everyone he saw. One of the ways in which he helped in those early days was to take under his wing the students who were athletes. He was the first coach for the soccer team, and he often would take the students who were in athletics and read them the riot act and say, athletics is wonderful, I'm very proud of you, finish your degree, finish your degree, finish your degree. One of those fellows from the 72, 73, 74 basketball team listened. He finished his degree. He became mayor of his town. He came to Solomon's memorial service some 40 years later to say thank you and to say that his own son was becoming a professor of English like Solomon. Solomon's worldview, his philosophy of life, was steeped in that profound wisdom of the West African oral tradition. That tradition was honed deepened, enriched over millennia. And its wisdom informed all of Solomon's efforts, teaching, scholarship, service, and expressed best in Proverbs. One hand cannot wash itself clean, Solomon often reminded us. It needs the help of the other. Thus, he enjoyed so much interacting with students, staff, administrators, faculty. All were his colleagues. All were his equals. All were his friends. That interaction, whether on a bench in the sun, in a classroom, over a cup of coffee in the cafeteria, in a hallway, around a conference table at a meeting, that exchange of ideas, sometimes clash of ideas, that invigorated Solomon's 44-year career. Students adored him. They painted his portrait, they brought him gifts. Most important to him was that they took his advice and they finished their degrees. They built themselves important lives. One of Solomon's students said, Solomon's heart was big enough to embrace all mankind. What distinguished Solomon then was his all-embracing heart, evidenced via his humanity, his compassion, his inclusiveness, and his dedication to helping others succeed. For his great heart, then, Solomon should be remembered. Thank you so much, Tomas, for your kind, thoughtful nomination. And thank you all of our colleagues at Cal State, for recognizing, remembering, and honoring Solomon.